What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining me on another FCP Euro DIY. Today we are working on our 2020 BMW 330xi. Today on the 3 Series, we are going to be covering how to replace your rear wheel bearings. This is going to be applicable to the G20 cars, all-wheel drive or not, as we are focusing on the rear. We have a DIY on the fronts for the all-wheel drive cars if you want to check that out on the channel as well. In front of us, we have the genuine bearings, which are available on fcpro.com, along with all the hardware needed to do this job. Typically, these bearings can last you anywhere from 60 to 100,000 miles. That's not to say they can't go to 200,000 miles or fail as early as 50,000 miles. Typically, what you want to look out for is if you start to get a noise at one corner of the car, whether it's the front or the rear, typically related to wheel speed, and as you go faster, it could get a little bit louder. Kind of sounds like a warble noise coming from the corner. Usually that's a good indicator that the wheel bearing's going bad. With wheel bearings, just like brakes, it's important that you do them in pairs, so you do both sides at the same time. You never want to do just one, because if one has started to fail or failed, the other one will follow suit. Another thing you can do is jack up the car and then grab the wheel and just try to give it a shake in a couple different directions to see if you have some play. Just be mindful that that can also be bad ball joints as well. Before we get into this though, let's take a look at some of the tools you're going to need for this DIY. All right, for this DIY, we have what looks like a lot of tools, but really it's not. It's just a lot of duplicates. It's really just a lot of duplicates of what's already on the table. We have both 1/2-inch drive and 3/8 drive torque wrenches. We have 2 of everything because some are fixed head, like this one here, and some of them are a flex head, like this one right here, which is going to come in super handy in these super tight spaces that we're going to be working today doing the rear wheel bearings. Same thing, we have 1/2-inch drive and 3/8 drive ratchets. We have 21 mil and 18 mil wrenches, as well as a very thin 17. That's only necessary if you're taking the caliper off of the caliper bracket, which is what we're going to do today. As far as sockets go, we have a 17 mil for the lug bolts. Specialty sockets for this DIY are going to be a set of e-torque sockets. If you have a basic set, that should cover you. But as far as sizing goes, we have a E22, an E20, and an E12. We have a TP60. This is a Torx Plus 60 bit. This is specific to the new hardware that holds on the wheel bearings on most new G chassis BMWs. They have a bigger square head than the standard T60 bit. If you have a regular T60 bit, that will not work. You will just strip out the hardware trying to get it out, and then you're going to have a whole lot more work ahead of you. So make sure you get the TP60 Torx bit. We have a 17 millimeter hex, a 6 millimeter hex, a 14 mil socket. This is just a shallow socket, and a medium 10 mil. We also have adapters and extensions for both the 1/2-inch drive and 3/8 drive, everything from a 3-inch to a 6-inch. We have a Sharpie. We're going to have to mark some hardware. The torque specs for the wheel bearing hardware is very specific and very tedious, so that's going to make things easier. Some torque seal, a flathead screwdriver, some electric tools. We have a 1/2-inch impact and a 3/8 drive ratchet. And then not pictured here but needed is going to be either a free floor jack if you're going to be working on the ground, or a free screw jack if you're on the lift. Now with that, let's go ahead and get started. All right, we're going to be working on the rear passenger side of the G20 today. However, the steps are going to be identical for both sides. Really the only thing to consider is that the driver's side on this car at least has a headlight level sensor, so you may want to release that from the subframe, 10 mil bolt, before you lower the arm down, which we'll get to in a little bit as we gain access to the bearing. But for now, 5 17 millimeter lug bolts. Let's take those off. The next 2 things that we do are going to be super important. They're going to determine whether or not we do this job at all. And that's going to be making sure, 1, we can get the brake disc set screw off, and 2, free up the axle bolt. So to do that, I like to thread in a wheel bolt once more, just to help kind of hold the hub and the disc from spinning apart on each other. Sometimes that can happen, especially when you're tightening down the hardware. We're going to put a flathead screwdriver through the vein of the brake disc. That's going to keep everything from turning on us as well. 17 mil hex for the axle bolt. On the impact, makes light work of that. Make sure it's situated all the way in. And boom. toss this because they are one-time use. You don't want to mix it up with your fresh hardware. Next, we want to make sure that the set screw comes off. These brakes are pretty fresh. We just filmed these about 2 weeks ago. So I have all the faith that that 6mm hex will come out, but it's still good insurance to practice before actually taking everything else apart. So if this doesn't come off, then you can't get the wheel bearing done. There's no point in going any further. Make sure that 6mm hex is situated all the way in. All right, that's gonna come free, no problem. So we're gonna let that sit for now. With that, we are going to work on removing the caliper. You can go about this 2 ways. If you've seen the brake DIY on this car, you'll know that the caliper carrier bracket can stay, the disc can come out of the way, and we'll also have room to do the wheel bearing. You can also just pull the whole assembly as one. It really doesn't make a difference. For us today, we're just going to take the caliper off, 2 14 mils, and possibly needed the thin 17 mil wrench to counterhold. So let's get that off. So first I'm going to break the 2 14 mils free, counter holding with the 17 if we need it. Sometimes those can spin on us, sometimes they don't. And this time we're good. Zap that out the rest of the way. And let's do the same thing to the top. All right, now that that's free, we can take our caliper and we're just going to gently swing it over the upper control arm here. These have short lines and cables going to the electronic parking brake, so there's really not much need for us to hang it. If you didn't already, don't forget to undo the brake pad wear sensor before you pull this off, because the pads are going to stay behind. All right. We can just swing that baby over like that. We're going to pull the pads out. Just as a reminder, the one with the larger hump goes on the inboard side for the brake pad wear sensor, and the one with the flat hump on the outside. All right, now we have that situated. The last thing is going to be, at least on this side of things, is to just undo the 3 bolts for the shock mount now. So let's get that situated. We have 3 E12s holding the shock mount in place. We're gonna zap those out. And last on our list is just to get that set screw off the rest of the way so that we can get the brake disc out of our way. Again, 6mm hex. And we'll set this to the side. All right, one last good step here before you get underneath the car. You can see the threads of the wheel hub assembly bolts poking through. This car's not that old, but there's still enough corrosion on there where it's gonna make it a little bit hard to get these out. So you can hit these with a wire wheel, some penetrating fluid, let them sit for a minute. And then by the time you get to the actual removal process of these bolts, they should be nice and soaked and ready to go. One last thing before we get underneath, don't forget to pull the wheel speed sensor off of the little tab here on the shock body, since we're going to be pulling that out. Now we're good. We have 4 10mm nuts holding up this shield, so let's zap those out next. All right, we're going to set this baby to the side. And then we are going to get our screw jack under here so that we can support this lower spring arm, so that we can undo the lower shock bolt as well as the lower control arm bolt. That's going to allow us to swing this down. We'll get the shock out and the coil spring out, which is going to give us room to work with. One thing to mention before we undo all of this, again, these bolts are also one-time use. They are also linked in the video description down below. BMW's write-up calls for just the shock mount to be removed, but then to get the spring out, you have to use a spring compressor tool, a smaller, thin one that you can fit in here and get this out. Honestly, the reality is, if you're doing this at home, it's going to be much easier to just undo these 2 bolts, get 2 new bolts, and get everything out without any additional special tools. So that's how we're going to roll with it for today. Another thing to note is when we tighten all this hardware back up, it's going to be at ride height, meaning what the car sits at when it's on the ground. So for us, typically we just take the weight off this corner of the car. Once we start coming up the lift pad or the jack stand, we know we're good. The other thing you can do before you take anything apart is measure the distance between the hub and the fender liner or fender line, and just keep that distance in mind. So when you set everything back up to load, you can use that distance to see if you're at actual ride height or not. So in this case, all I'm doing right now is just taking off some of the load so that we can undo this hardware and nothing springing all over the place. Let's start with the shock mount. We have an 18 mil nut. And on the opposite side, we're gonna zap that out with an E20. That's one out. And again, this we're gonna toss. We have new hardware. These are stretch bolts, so they're only good for one time. On this side, we have our larger E22 and a 21 mil nut on the opposite side. So we will counter hold with the 21 mil wrench. Now with that, we can lower down the spring arm, again, gently. Once it has no load, then we can work on pulling out the shock and the spring. Now we can do our shock and spring. All right, we'll set these two babies to the side. One more thing, which is if you want to tackle it but not necessary, you can remove this lower forward arm. This hardware is just 100 Newton meters on both ends, so technically you could reuse it if you find yourself needing the room to swing the torque wrench or the ratchet, which we might do. So again, just in case you are following along, you can lower these lower forward arms, get them out of your way, and then when we tighten everything at right height, we can redo them. So I'm not sure if we're gonna pull them off just yet, but just fair warning, you have a 16 and an 18 on both sides. So if you're looking at this before doing the job, grab those sockets or wrenches too. All right, now that we have the spring and shock assembly out of the way, we have room to get to the back wheel bearing hardware. So let's do that now. So we're just gonna work our way around as far as removing them goes. We're gonna start with the bottom left. Whatever you do, whether you're doing an impact or a ratchet, just make sure that the bit is fully situated, because if you strip these out when you're pulling them out, you're not gonna really be able to get them out after that. So just be mindful. Just pull the axle down a little bit. For this bolt, the top left for removal and install, this upper control arm can be in the way of what we're doing here. So it's up to you. This will be linked in the video description. If you want to remove it, this is a one-time use bolt as well. So we're going to be doing an entire DIY on this with all the control arms. So I'm not too worried about pulling it out and throwing it back in if we need to for this video. But again, one-time use bolt. We'll drop the link in the video description below for you, should you want to get that one as well. You can see when we go in with this, we have enough bite on the bit, but it does make for a tight fit. With the removal, not too much of a big deal, but when it comes time to installing everything, we want to make sure we have a good bite on that bolt. All right, now that it's broken a little bit loose, we can switch over to the 3/8 drive ratchet with an adapter for the 1/2 incher. And just zap it out. Having the second set of hands here to help you is also not the worst idea. So I'm gonna go in with the flex head now that I got at least half a turn on it. So I think. Okay, there we go. And the flex head can get between the knuckle and the lower spring arm. And once it's loose, we zap it out the rest of the way. All right, let's get that last bolt out of here. And now we can get the wheel bearing off from the front. Sometimes these bearings, you're lucky and they just pull off. If not, you might want to be prepared and just grab a hammer before you get started so you can get it off with some percussive encouragement. There we go. With that, you'll notice that the bolt holes are tighter up top than they are at the bottom, meaning that these hub assemblies can only go on one way. Before we even worry about that though, we're gonna clean up some of this dirt, get some of this grime out of here, and some of the oxidation, so we can prep the surface for our new assembly. While you're doing any work in here, just be mindful that the wheel speed sensor is right here on the inside. Don't hit it with anything hard or metal. You can wipe it down as you're cleaning, but that's kind of about it. And if you're spraying brake cleaner like we are today, don't blast it into the inside of the axle. You're gonna get it into the boot. So just work your way kind of around it. All right, with that, we have a nice clean face, nice clean spindle, wheel carrier, call it what you like, ready to receive our new bearing. So what I'm gonna do is press the new bearing on by hand and then reach from behind and just get one or two of the bolts started of the new hardware so that it holds everything in place. Then we can hop to the back side and get the rest of them started by hand. So just as a reminder, 2 tighter holes or 2 shorter distance holes go up top, and the 2 wider ones are facing the bottom. That should seat in really nicely. Not too much fuss. And it doesn't really matter which bolt you get started. For me, these top ones are easy to get to from back here without really looking. So we'll get that started. Again, new hardware only. These are torque to yield bolts. They are not reusable, so please do not reuse the ones you took out. All right, that's enough to keep this hub assembly in place. Let's get up a little bit higher. We'll get behind it and we'll get the other 2 bolts started. And then from there, we have a really cool sequence to tighten on the hardware. It's not really that cool. It's kind of annoying, but with that, let's get to it. I'm doing these by hand and not with the electric ratchet, mainly because the initial torque sequence or torque spec is super low, and there's a good chance that my electric ratchet can go past that. So just do it by hand to play it safe, and that way you're not over torquing incorrectly. All right, step 1, we're gonna work in a crisscross pattern. You can start however you like. It's gonna be 20 Newton meters on all 4 bolts first. So let's get that torque wrench set up, and we'll start with the initial 20. All right, we got the TP60 in there with a small 2-inch extension and a 3/8 to 1/2-inch adapter. And we're just gonna work our way in a crisscross pattern to 20 Newton meters first. Again, being super careful with this top left one since we're fighting the upper control arm. And the key with that top right is to just pull your lower control arm down and give yourself room to work with. This is the easiest one, so at least you reward yourself with an easy one at a certain point. All right, now that they are all at 120, the next torque spec is going to be 140 Newton meters, same crisscross pattern. Flex head torque wrench for this one's going to be super helpful. Okay. Okay. Now let's do the next top left. What I'm doing here is just moving the axle as far away from each bolt that I'm working on as possible to give me the most room. Okay. Okay. All right, now comes the next fun part where we're gonna mark all our bolts with a Sharpie, and we're gonna back them all up. Yes, that means remove them an 1/8 of a turn or 45 degrees, whichever one you can measure easier, in the same crisscross pattern. I know, it gets a little crazy. So we're just gonna use a little Sharpie mark so we know how far the bolt has traveled. So I'm just gonna mark them to the best of my ability at where that 45 or 1/8 turn is gonna be, so that they kind of end up in a 12 o'clock position when I have achieved what I want. 2 steps left to go. The next step is gonna be in the same crisscross pattern, 120 Newton meters all the way around. So let's do that now. All right, like I said, crisscross pattern, step number 4 out of 5 is going to be 120 Newton meters all the way around. All right, step 4 is done. Now comes step 5, the last fun and final step, which is turning all the hardware an additional 90 degrees. So you can make a new mark, or you with a different color Sharpie maybe, or you can use the one that you already have. But the idea is to rotate the bolt an additional 1/4 turn. And what you want to look for is basically that the gap between the end of the axle stub and the front of these, or the back of the spindle and the front of the axle stub are nice and even. So right now you can see the teeth there, they're not really lined up to anything. I'm just gonna push and rotate until it feels good. I can also spin the hub on the front side of things so I get a good bite. There we go. That feels nice, and I'm just gonna take our new axle bolt and thread it in now just to get things started. So you can always look down the center to make sure it's nice and straight, but usually if your bolt starts in nicely, then you should be pretty good to go. 17 mil hex, just by hand. We're gonna go as far as we can. And I'm continuously feeling, making sure that the back of the, what's it called? The back of the axle feels nicely seated against our. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna spin the opposite wheel. I'm just gonna keep an eye on the front half of the axle stub here and make sure that as it's rotating, the gap between that and the spindle is nice and even. At this point, we have our wheel hub assembly bolted in nicely. The axle bolt is still loose. That's gonna be the last thing we do. Next, we're gonna feed our shock and coil spring back in. We'll button up this hardware down here, and then we'll move back up top. So let's do that now. Coil spring is going back in. Making sure that the dowel for the spring seat's going to line up nicely with the bottom of the control arm. Looks good. The top looks great. Now let's get the shock assembly and just start feeding that up. Mindful of the ABS wire. All right. That looks good. I'm just checking the coil spring, meeting up with the little stop on the spring pad shim, and that all looks great. So from there, we're just gonna throw the shock bolt in now nice and loosely. Next, we'll do the new lower control arm bolt for the spring arm. And for that, we're gonna grab our screw jack and just get everything situated. So one thing I'm doing right now is just making sure that the top of the shock mount, where it lives inside of the wheel well, is sitting in the correct spot. We have no hardware in it now. You can throw it in now if you'd like, especially if you're working on the ground, you can just reach up. For us, it's a little bit out of the way, but as long as it's sitting where it's going to be living, then we can put a load on this and it's not going to hurt anything. We're going to continue going up. I'm just lining up the bolt hole for that new hardware. Push that baby through, get that 21 mil nut on the other side. And now we're gonna set ride height. Again, we're just taking off the load on the lift arm on this side, but if you did already, you can just use your measurement from the center of the hub to the arch on the wheel well, and that will be good as well. All right. Let's start with the shock mount bolt. We're gonna need an 18 millimeter wrench to counter hold. And I'm going to use the little electric ratchet just to snug up the hardware quickly, and then we will torque it down properly. And for that, we're going to need an E20 on the opposite side. That ratchet just has enough juice. And then for this, we're going to use the fixed head torque wrench, just so we're not fighting, trying to keep it straight. Torque spec for this shock bolt is going to be 100 Newton meters plus an additional 90 degrees. So again, one-time use hardware, nothing but the best, baby. There's our 100, and then an additional 90. Same thing, you can mark the hardware. See where your 90 is gonna be. I'm just gonna do this. Okay. Now we're gonna do the E22 and a 21 millimeter wrench to counter hold. Torque spec for this bolt is 165 Newton meters, plus an additional 90 degrees. So again, sticking on the theme of one-time use hardware, we'll drive it home with the electric ratchet first, and then we'll torque it up. E22 on the torque wrench, 165 plus 90 degrees. There's our 165. There's our 90. Oh, and while you're here, you can see clearly the wheel speed sensor. You can tuck that back into the little tab coming off of the shock body if you haven't done so already, just so you don't forget later. All right, I'm gonna remove the screw jack. We'll get our little shield under the control arm back in for our MPGs, and then we'll go from there. This just lives on the 4 studs coming off of the bottom of the arm. Pretty straightforward. 4 10 millimeter nuts. We're just gonna snug them up using the electric ratchet. Now with that, let's get out from underneath the car. Everything is buttoned up on the underside. Let's get our brake disc back on, our caliper, button up that shock mount and go from there. We're gonna get our 3 E12s started by hand for the shock mount. Now let's set the torque wrench to stun, AKA 28 Newton meters for these E12s. All right, with that situated, let's get our brake disc back on. One quick tip, if this is your longtime car or your forever car, whatever it may be, or you just want to make it easier to work on next time, with the exposed threads on the front side of the hub assembly, you can paint these, you can put a little bit of look ceramic paste on them, something to kind of encapsulate them to keep them from rotting in the long run. So not a bad idea if you choose to do that now. I'll show you what I'm talking about using some of this paste. I'm just going to cover them, spread it around the head of the bolt. And, you know, in the next 100,000 miles or 10 years or whenever they may be due again, they should be a little bit easier to get out. Same thing goes for the actual front of our hub, so that our brake disc does not seize. And then this is totally overkill, but I like to put some paste where the set screw goes. It's not a high Newton, or it's not a high torque value that they call for, and there's nothing worse than having to drill out a set screw. So whatever you can do to keep that nice and fresh for the next time you get in here. And now we can slide our brake disc back in. I kind of just like to spin it a couple times and spread that goodness around while I look for the set screw. 6mm hex. Get this baby snugged up. Torque spec for this is going to be 16 Newton meters. You can either just use the calibrated wrist, or if you still have the torque wrench out, go ahead and use that as well. As you snug it down, just make sure the face of the disc is sitting nice and flush up against the hub. There you can see, not a whole lot. All right, we're gonna get our brake pads back in, and then we'll get the caliper situated. These brakes have only a couple 100 miles on them. We just did them not too long ago for a video. So I'm just giving the areas where the pads are gonna ride a little wipe down and a fresh coat of some paste on the ears. Again, if you took off the whole caliper with the bracket assembly, then you're gonna be messing with the E-torque spec there. The torque spec for those is 135 Newton meters, should you be doing it that way. Don't forget the inner pad on the passenger side has the hump, and that is gonna be for the brake pad wear sensor. All right, let's get those 214 started by hand. 35 Newton meters for just these 14mm bolts. And then we're just gonna get our brake pad wear sensor situated. If you're doing that, just make sure that the little stub, the little nub faces outboard. That's what's gonna make contact with the brake disc once it wears, and is gonna trigger the light on the dash. All right, at this point we have our brakes situated. Our brake disc is good to go. Set screw is done. Shock, spring, control arm hardware, all of that is good. All that we have left is the actual axle bolt. So for that, we're gonna do the reverse of what we did earlier today. We're gonna throw in a lug bolt. Then we're gonna throw in the flathead screwdriver in the vein of the brake disc so that it locks up against the caliper. It's not gonna hurt anything. And then we're gonna grab our 17mm hex and our torque wrench. The torque spec for this big guy here is going to be 210 Newton meters plus an additional 90 degrees. I'm gonna raise the car up a bit so I can use my body weight to make that a lot easier. And we're one step closer to finishing up. All right, 17mm hex, initial 210 Newton meters first. Make sure that baby's situated all the way in. All right. And then if you still have your Sharpie out, go ahead and make a little paint mark on that so that you can keep track of your additional 90 degrees. I'm going to do it so that the mark ends up on the bottom, and then I can put a little bit of torque seal on my bolt. And there is our 90. All right, let me get a little bit more eye level with this. We'll mark the bolt and then throw our wheel back on and get one step closer to finishing up. A little bit of torque seal on the bolt. I'm just gonna let it kind of drip down. It doesn't have to be perfect with this. We just want it to be kind of where it should be. So if this does come loose, one, it'll rip the seal, but two, we'll be able to tell if it rotated. Now this car can get its wheel back on. We do have a wheel spacer that is running to give it that nice flush look. Let's get that baby on there. Get a 17 ready. Always start your lug bolts by hand, especially after doing a wheel hub replacement. The last thing you want to do is mess up the threads on your fresh hub. All right, we're going to snug these up in a crisscross pattern with the 17 on the impact, just at a low setting, so that we know that the wheel is sitting flush against the hub. All right, now let's drop the car back on the ground. We're going to torque them to 140 Newton meters in the same crisscross pattern. And that's going to conclude the DIY for today, my good people. Overall, a really straightforward process on the G20, very similar to the front, if you haven't seen that video already, which is also on the YouTube channel. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave those in the comment section below. And if you like this DIY and you'd like to see more like them, consider subscribing. We're making new ones all day long. And if you want to see things that are a little bit more fun and entertaining, head over to the FCP Media channel. We have some good stuff there as well. As always, thank you for watching. I'll catch you on the next one.